And welcome to part 4 of Sun Tzu's Art of Warhammer, where we look at some of the quotes from the great Chinese general Sun Tzu and from his Art of War collection and see how we can apply it to tabletop gaming, with a particular focus in this series on Age of Sigmar, especially when I've been watching a lot of battle reports, been watching even more battle reports in the last week as well, trying to find common errors and how Sun Tzu's wisdom could actually help us out. In this episode, we're going to talk about the battle itself. So we've gone through army building, deployment, the initial engagement. So these are sort of the turns once that initial engagement has occurred. So the first quote is, "To move your enemy, entice them with something they are sure to take." Now, especially with the concept of objectives in Age of Sigmar, when it comes to moving, it's sort of fairly obvious where you need to go, where your opponent wants to be able to go as well. It's not absolutely essential to capture all objectives though, so sometimes it can be just a case of capturing enough to at least keep step with your opponent until you can have a decisive victory later on, or even to be beating them in the early stages. These are for objectives where you get points per turn. Sometimes you don't, sometimes it's just about capturing them at a certain point or later on. But how can you entice them? Now, generally speaking, what you might offer up is a lure, which is a weaker area or something that appears weak, where they take the bait and then you come and smash in, you spring a trap. It's not as easy to spring a trap in Age of Sigmar, or any tabletop game, because as players we're omniscient, we can see units, you can't really conceal units. All we can really conceal is what we're going to do with them. So what you need to do instead is either to threaten some part of your army in force. If you threaten a weakened area that you have created, then it sort of forces your opponent to move their army to reinforce it. Or it could be to threaten an area that they just cannot afford to lose, whether it be a key unit, whether it be an objective. That's basically the way you will lead them on a merry dance, and that's ultimately what you want to do as well. In order to be sure of winning, you want to be able to dictate everything about the game, and that includes where your opponent goes. Make them react to you rather than be able to carry out their battle plan. So the next quote here: "The winning army realizes the conditions for victory first, then fights." The number of fights I've seen where it's just basically a scrap. And that's obviously the main part of the game, isn't it? That's the fun of the game. That's what it used to be like with the old pitch battles as well. And you could play a pitch battle in Age of Sigmar, of course. It's just one army against another. But again, I'm thinking very much in terms of tournaments where you'd be using one of the battle plans in the core rulebook. In reality, it's about capturing objectives. The major victory conditions are all about capturing objectives. Doing harm to your opponent's army whilst reducing the amount of harm done to your own only comes into it if victory points is even either side. The number of people I've seen play a game in such a way that seemingly ignores the objectives, and so you get to turn 3 and one player is way ahead in victory points than the other, and there's no realistic way back for the other player. Or something like that, or the opponent's just holding so many of these objectives that you can't realistically, when it comes to like turn 4 and 5, you can't realistically capture enough for you to get that major victory. And it's because they spent their time chasing their tail, potentially chasing after units. Maybe their opponent was leading them around with tempting units, just to draw them away from the objectives whilst the rest of their army captured those objectives. And I think you need a focus on exactly what the victory conditions are at all times. Of course, you don't want to ignore a fight that you can win. You absolutely need to destroy whatever weakened parts of your opponent's army you can, which we'll come to later. But always have in your mind, how in this turn am I going to strengthen my capture of the objectives? Or if you've already in a really strong position, how am I going to hold them? What's my opponent likely to do to try and take them off me, and what can I do to reinforce them? Next quote, it says, attack where he is unprepared, appear where you are not expected. Now again, what this is basically saying is your opponent expects a particular maneuver and you pull out another one. We can't do it with concealment. Again, we have very few options in that regard, but what we do have is the option to strike in multiple areas. We've talked about this before when it comes to deployment, because of course the way you set this up is in deployment, but now in the battle is where it pays off. If you can only attack one area sensibly, you can either choose to attack a particular area or just not attack at all. Your opponent will have seen that coming. They've had a turn to prepare in all likelihood, unless you get a double turn, of course that happens. And they can reinforce that area, in which case it might be a 50-50 thing at best in your favour. The alternative is potentially it would be a poor choice to make the charge anyway. What you ideally want is to be able to have two sensible lines of attack with a significant strike force, so that a couple of things. First of all, you might get your opponent believing you're going to attack one way, where indeed you actually attack a weaker area that they've taken their eye off, or if they recognise the danger, they recognise that you could actually go this way or that way, that they then struggle to make a decision about how best to protect it, because they can't reinforce adequately both areas potentially, because effectively they've got their army split in two and you're taking what should be a strong force to attack just one of them. Now, the other thing is, obviously doing what your opponent doesn't expect you to do can also get them to question their battle strategy, but you don't want to do completely mad things unless there's nothing else to do. I mean, what I would suggest, and I think I've suggested this before, is sometimes, just as a last desperate gamble, if you cannot think of any way in which you can improve your position in a particular turn, then it might be better to act erratically than predictably in a losing position, just in case it throws your opponent off and they make a mistake. But generally speaking, what you want to do is be in control of the situation, and being in control of the situation means that what you're doing is not random, just unexpected. And the next little quote there says, you can be sure of succeeding in your attacks if you only attack places which are undefended. And this is as true in any game like this. What you want to do is pick off your opponent's weaker areas and then try and retreat. And what's ideal for this, what is most ideal, is a highly mobile, highly maneuverable elite strike force. So the ideal combination are elite models which have a lot of attacks that are likely to do a fair amount of damage, high movement, and potentially, or preferably I should say, the ability to fly. If you've got units like this, then they can attack areas at fairly long range, and the important thing is they don't have to worry about obstacles too much either. And then when they've attacked that and your opponent is thinking about reinforcing it in the next turn, you can potentially retreat away as well to safety to strike somewhere else. But even if you don't have the capacity to quickly move in and quickly move out, maybe your opponent has an even faster army. I mean, I'm talking about at the moment building up a Nighthaunt army. I'll also be doing a Nurgle army, I hope, at some point as well. The fact of the matter is, you may come up against an army that's even more maneuverable. They're more likely to do that to you. You don't really want to spread things out, or you don't, for whatever reason, have the capacity to do that. You still want to make sure you are only attacking where your opponent is weak, and you have to be able to do this. There's no point in just going, oh, well, this is my best option, I'll just throw everything forward to the centre. Apart from anything else, the centre is usually, if someone is deploying randomly, likely to be the strongest area anyway, because most people tend to build a deployment around their stronger units, because very few people seriously think about deployment other than moving units in such a position that they can capture the objectives, rather than thinking about the structure of it. But this opens up opportunities as well, because what it can mean is that your opponent can have the weaker units on flanks, and then the flanks, if you can maneuver around there, can be rich pickings. And again, even if you can't retreat out of the way once you've attacked, you've still weakened that army, well, then you may be able to move into a stronger position to attack the stronger units. Now, the next quote is sort of the converse of this. It says, you can ensure the safety of your defense if you only hold positions that cannot be attacked. So when deciding which objectives you want to go for, let's say you've got the battle plan where, for example, there are 4 objectives, 1 in your territory, 1 in your opponent's territory, 2 on the border, and it's basically, you know, you get 1 point for holding the 1 in your territory, 2 points for holding either of the ones on the border, which means 4 points if you've got both of them, or 4 points for holding one in your opponent's territory. In a situation like that, it's not realistic to hold all 4. How can you do that unless you've completely massacred your opponent? What you want to do really is potentially hold 2 of them or 3 of them. But if you can hold 2 of them that are high value, if you can hold one in your opponent's territory and one on the border, well then you will at least match what your opponent can do. But what you want to do is think about when you're deciding which objectives you need to hold. You don't want to hold all of them. It's not realistic. Which are the best ones to defend? Because sometimes people will just try and go for which they think are the closest. But maybe it's better to just go for the ones, as long as you can get there first, that are the most difficult to attack. Now, there's a couple of ways in which you make it effectively impossible to attack. One is making it hugely undesirable. So that could mean, for example, that you put such a strong garrison there, or that you put an adequate garrison there, but you've got other units in the area which, if they go in, could come behind them, and they're effectively encircled and therefore likely to be whittled down fairly quickly. That's one way. Just make it a hugely undesirable line of attack. Scenery can come to your aid here. So in terms of being able to lay a trap, if you can cut off several lines of attack with scenery that's effectively impassable for all but flying units, then you can help with that one. The second way is to physically blockade them. So sending in a unit that's large, you know, a speed bump unit, a horde type unit that's nonetheless fairly tough, so not going to be easy to break down. Big old unit of zombies or plague bringers or chain rasp hordes, skeletons, something like that, that can just hold a position so your opponent physically can't wade through. Again, flying units will usually be able to circumvent both of those. It's a little bit trickier. And again, like I say, a Knight's Horns army that I'm trying to construct might be difficult to do any of that. But those are the sort of things you want to be trying to do. But certainly what you want to be doing, if you're thinking of going for limited numbers of objectives, if there's multiple on offer, which ones are the easiest to hold? That's ultimately what you want to do. Not necessarily which ones are the quickest to gain. The next quote was, "Hence the general is skillful in attack whose opponent does not know what to defend, and skillful in defense whose opponent does not know what to attack." So the way you can enact this is to give your opponent options, but where no option is really an easy win. So in terms of your opponent not knowing what to attack, of course, you want to create a situation where realistically they could attack 2 different areas, whether it's 2 objectives you're holding or 2 different sections of your army, but neither one are they super confident about. In a situation like this, wherever a decision has to be made where there isn't an easy win, then there will be hesitancy. And where there's hesitancy, they will tend to doubt themselves and may make a poor decision. And in terms of not knowing what to defend either, this could be a situation where you are effectively attacking on 2 fronts. Now, you have to be careful with this, of course. It's quite easy to split your army into 2 or even 3 parts and attack down 2 sides, in which case you're threatening both flanks. But it's not really a threat to their flanks unless the force you are threatening with will almost certainly overrun the units that you are threatening. So you have to make sure you have the capacity to do that. Now, it's not always easy to do that initially because you've got a matched army. You've both got 2,000 points, unless someone's made a dreadful error with either their deployment or their army choice. Then it's very likely that doing that is just actually weakening your army. But later on, if you've had a couple of victories and you've whittled your opponent down, this again presents you with more opportunities, which is actually ironically the last quote, to be able to do that, to actually attack 2 areas, get your opponent worried about, well, which do they defend? If they come to the conclusion that they can't defend both, they're effectively having to make the decision, which do they abandon? And can they afford to abandon it? If they can't afford to abandon either, you really do put them on the horns of a dilemma and are very likely to make a mistake at this point. Next quote, a bit of a longer one. It says, "If we wish to fight, the enemy can be forced to an engagement even though he be sheltered behind a high rampart and a deep ditch. All we need do is attack some other place that he will be obliged to relieve. Now, obviously, we don't worry too much about ramparts and deep ditches, but nonetheless, the idea that an opponent can be entrenched. They've got objective, they're entrenched, they've basically got their army together. You don't really fancy taking it on with just a bit of your army, and you're not going to take it on with a whole huge block either. The problem with attacking an entrenched army, even in Age of Sigmar, is that to move across the battlefield, the only reliable movement you've got is your movement characteristic. So in the movement phase, you do that. You then have the choice, if you're not going to be able to charge and you need to cover some ground, then you've got a run move. But that run move is variable. You're rolling a d6. So for some units it could be 1, for some units it could be 6. So unless you hold back at the pace of the slowest of the units, you are going to get out of kilter, out of formation. But then, even when it comes to the charge, and we discussed this before in the previous episode, the issue can be you could have 3 or even 4 units ranged for a charge, but they're a little bit out, 7 or 8 inches out. So you roll your charges, and it might be that you can't actually charge in with all of those units. And against an entrenched opponent, well, if you can't do that, then you might create a situation where if you make the charges you can, well, you might lose those units against overwhelming odds. And then, of course, you've just gifted your opponent 2 units. The remaining units are now too weak to attack. So what you want to do in that situation is make those random rolls work for you instead of against you. And the way to do that is to get your opponents to come to you. And the only way to do that is to move somewhere where they have to move to, otherwise they're going to lose the game. And this is where the objectives come in very handy. They cannot realistically, for most battle plans, sit on an objective with the whole of their army. Because if you capture 2 objectives, then you are likely to be automatically winning. So you force them in that situation to move out, because you are now the one who can afford to sit back and wait for them to move out, where those run rolls and those charge rolls, those random rolls, will make them the victim instead of you the victim. And the final one, which I've already touched on a little bit here, but very important to remember, it's why it's really important to get a good start with these games. Opportunities multiply as they are seized. So this is the idea that both players will have opportunities. If you've both come up with decent armies and you've got a battle plan in mind and you've deployed well, then luck isn't going to allow one person to win straight away. So doesn't matter who gets the first turn. Each player is going to get opportunities to seize the initiative. And the first person to do that is likely to have more opportunities in the next turn, and so on. It's simple enough. If you have a really good first skirmish, first combat phase, then you can potentially take out an enemy unit or at least whittle it down. All of a sudden, these evenly matched armies, this matched play armies, are now not matched because one player has suffered more casualties than the other. It might not even be to do with casualties. It might be that one player has better positions than another when it comes to the objectives. And when you're in that position, your opponent is forced to react. They're now on the back foot. They're having to play catch up, and you are not. You are in control, and all you need to do, realistically, it's easier said than done, is to maintain that control by making sure you take the other opportunities that will come your way, because you are in a much better position if you control the locations you want and you've now got superior forces because you've won the first combat. You're in a position, or more in a position, to be able to pick and choose your fights. And again, it's easier for you to be able to attack your opponent where they're weakest, because there will absolutely be places where they are weak, and then you further increase your advantage over them. So, those are how more of the quotes from Sun Tzu can apply to games of Age of Sigmar, or indeed any tabletop gaming. Hope you've enjoyed the episode. If you have, don't forget to like, comment, subscribe and share for further content. And next week we'll be back with another one. Until then, I'll see you later.